All right.
Cinema is more than just a window into reality. It can also be a journey into the abstract, where images and sounds transcend the familiar. This is the world of experimental and alchemic cinema, where the boundaries of traditional filmmaking dissolve and new forms of storytelling are born. Experimental cinema breaks away from conventional narratives, focusing instead on sensory experiences, emotion, and abstract ideas. Alchemic cinema, a subset, explores the transformative process of filmmaking, where the filmmaker is not just a storyteller, but an alchemist, crafting the audience's perception through elemental visuals, sounds, and symbols.
Our films are very formal, and we try to make them very musical. And we mean something very particular by that. What we're aiming to achieve is an abstract structure that nonetheless holds together like an arc.
Look what happens to this bus.
Yeah? So our films are very much about the total duration. We need people to watch the whole film. And our concerns within the film are typically abstract and graphic and rhythmic and to do with patterns and light and shade. We're trying to make an experience for the retina, for the eye and the brain, more than we are about trying to convey some point or information or something meaningful. We think that if you're interested in meaning and concepts, there are better forms than motion picture, especially experimental motion picture. So we also think, or I also think, that one of the features of being human is that we'll find meaning in anything. So we let meaning rise by itself. We let concepts just happen on their own. Eventually, when we get to an editing stage, we'll begin to think, this makes sense from a conceptual point of view. We might change the title that we've been working on because we see now what the film is about, or we see now a layer of concept that is there that we hadn't been working with, but is naturally emerged. I do like showing our work to people who don't have an experimental background. In some respects, I think it helps keep us honest as filmmakers. We usually find with a non-film audience that some people find the patterns and rhythms confronting, but other people pass through that and are able to sit back and relax and enjoy these rhythms and things that are happening. And they can be quite passionate about their response. They can really enjoy our films. There aren't so many of us around, and there are definitely people who are fans of this kind of approach to experimental cinema, the materialist, structuralist approach. And we get a lot of very positive feedback from them. But it's not everyone's cup of tea, because some people are first and foremost interested in the conceptual and in contemporary concerns. And, experimental film is probably the broadest category of film, and there has to be room for everybody. My first exposure to this kind of filmmaking was back in the 80s, back in the late 80s, in the Melbourne Super 8 scene, which was a very insular scene. We didn't have the internet, of course, and we didn't have access to a collection of films, and most of the people in the scene weren't studying experimental film. There wasn't so much study of experimental film in Melbourne. So it was kind of naive, and it was beautiful. It organically was a scene that was very interested in the kind of film that we make now, in materialist, formal, experimental, structureless kinds of films. Not everybody did that, and at the time I didn't do that. At the time I made narrative films. There were a number of Australian filmmakers at the time who are quite well known now, who were formative, and they were working in this tradition. And I'd like to single out Paul Winkler, who's a German immigrant to Australia. His films were deeply informative of my approach and my style. And also the Cantrells, in particular a film called Myself When 13, which is a very rigorous exploration of a very short sequence of maybe 5 seconds of a young person walking towards the camera, but each frame has been hand-colored, it's been printed on paper and hand-colored. And that rigorous approach that I came across in that film was very formative. And I guess at the time that's what I aspired to, but I didn't understand. When I returned to filmmaking in the early 2000s, that's where I went. And it was ready to come out. And it was a very, very productive time for me from then on. To some extent as an antidote or a relief or a detox from the digital thing. The AI is, of course, hyper-digital. This can be the complete opposite. And I do think this kind of filmmaking that we do, that's heavily emphasizing analog and material things, has a future in helping keeping experimental film grounded in the real world. Its danger, I think, is too much drifting into the world of the pixel. Yeah? One of the things that I find most engaging about analog experimental film is the way in which materialist analog cinema can tell us something about our material existence, our physical being in the world, a physical world. I haven't yet gotten that from digital experimental film. I can't see a logical reason why it can't, but I haven't seen it yet. And this is what I mean about going down the AI path, having to find a more humble aesthetic to connect it with the ground again, with the earth, and with physical things rather than just with pixels and numbers.
Richard and Diana are two pioneering figures in the experimental film world. Together, they have developed a unique philosophy that merges the mystical, philosophical, and practical aspects of filmmaking. The beauty of experimental cinema lies in its unpredictability. Often the filmmakers even don't know what the end result will be when they start. The process itself reveals the film.
My background was studying very formal things like logic and theoretical composition. And Super 8 film, though, was something that was just around in our household when I was growing up. My father had a Super 8 camera and made films of us and would show them on the living room wall. And somehow at some point, I felt that somehow all of the very formal and serious things in my life could come together with this very joyful thing in filmmaking and find a middle thing that was a kind of free expression that is visual and rhythmic and has many of the structural qualities of music, but comes from just an experience of living, an experience of perceiving, an experience of being in the moment, which you have when someone's projecting films for you. The sound has a few functions like helping you to feel that you're on a journey, that you are, either at the beginning or the middle, or you can feel the end is coming, which I think people need some kind of comfort in these films because there isn't like a clear story and there aren't like conflicts and resolutions of this kind of normal progression for people to feel they know where they fit in the time. But also the image and colour itself, we'd like to have things happening that are of a rhythmic or even a counterpoint nature, that bring a different seeing into what's happening on the screen, so that we'll show something and then seem to show it again and again, but each time actually there's a small change. And when you've been watching for a little while, you start to not just experience the broad initial thing, but then you start to experience just these subtle changes. And we like to think that this is like a kind of visual music that comes out of abstracting from images. And yeah, I feel you need to have had an experience of watching other kinds of cinema in order to come into experimental cinema. I think it does help that you're familiar with the general language of cinema. But a major difference, I think, between the very experimental cinema and regular cinema is kind of telling you what to think and what to feel, when to respond, and how to respond. Whereas we like with our films to create a space where you just find your own responses within you. So often people respond very differently to the same film in the same screening. You'll have some people find a film, very moving and sad, whereas other people found something's funny in it. And it all depends where you're at the time when you come to see it. We like this openness of it. We like the fact that what it does is just allows your brain to do various brain functions, and it just provides a few handholds and pointers, and then you just create the experience yourself. The collaboration between us is interesting. With every project, we really need to have one person in charge for that particular project. We did some time ago try to make a film where every decision was a joint decision between the two of us. And at the end of the project, neither of us liked anything that we'd done. We both felt, why did we do this? Well, I thought you would like it. You thought I would like that? I don't like this. So we started then to work in a way where there's one person who makes key kind of decisions and the other person is really just helping. A lot of what we do with analog film really requires two people. When you're doing complicated things, filming in the field, like you're in danger of falling off a road overpass or something, you need somebody who's keeping an eye on the traffic and someone who's using the camera. Or things to do with, we often do things where you have to rewind in the camera and you need someone to be counting how long each shot is, or things with the camera controls where you change things during the filming. And then there's the whole processing side of things, which is, we run a lab together. So who ends up doing different parts of the processing and post-production things is different each time. So we put both names on each film because we've definitely both worked on the film all the way through. But we know that there was somebody whose film it actually was.
Richard and Diana are not just filmmakers. They're also teachers, leading workshops that give aspiring filmmakers a hands-on experience in creating experimental and alchemic films.
Most of us who make these kinds of experimental films use spring-wound 16mm cameras. This one is a French camera, a Beaulieu. Later on, they went on to make electric cameras, but I like the spring-powered ones because you don't have to worry about batteries. I find they're more reliable. They work well in cold conditions and all sorts of things. They're very, very flexible, a spring-wound camera. It has a limitation, and that is the length of the spring. So I'm winding the spring now, and effectively what I'm doing is putting energy into it. I'm curling up this metal spring until it is fully curled and won't go any further. Then when I press the trigger, what happens is the spring is powering the mechanism as the spring unwinds. So there's a fixed amount of time that it'll run for. And as time passes, it will get a little bit slower. It's not a good camera for doing precise timing. It's a camera for, I mean, in productions they'd call it a B camera or something like that, because you can't use it for recording things like dialogue where you need perfect speed. So a spring-wound camera, though, it is very flexible. I like these ones. Normally I use a Bolex, which is slightly bigger and heavier, but for travel this is the smallest spring-wound camera I've got, and it's very good for travel. While it's a very simple camera, it is a reflex camera, so when you look through here, you are looking through the lens that's taking the picture, and that's I don't know, that's quite convenient. I don't insist on that, but it's a nice feature for such a small camera that it is in fact a reflex system. So this has a shutter that's opening and closing with every revolution, and as the shutter is closed, a mirrored surface on the shutter sends the light up to the viewfinder, and then the shutter opens and the light goes to the film, and then the shutter closes and it goes to the viewfinder. This is very common in motion picture cameras, where the viewfinder effectively blinks as you're filming. Okay, so these cameras, like the Bolex, have 3 lenses. They're on a turret, 3 lens mounts, I should say. So you can screw on multiple lenses. But for convenience today, I'm just going to use this little zoom lens. And it's a C-mount lens, which is very common, a 25mm screw thread. And you just screw it on. And there you are. That's the picture-taking position. If I wanted to use a different lens, I could screw it there at the same time and then just rotate like this and film with that lens, and then rotate back if I wanted to film with this one again. So turrets were very common when there were no zoom lenses, before zoom lenses. But zoom lenses are so convenient, and they're typically very good that turrets aren't really needed anymore. But it is useful when you're using what are called prime lenses, that is, lenses that aren't zooms. Prime lenses are theoretically sharper than zoom lenses, and they usually also let in more light. So this is the inside of the camera, and I'm now going to load it. Actually, before we start, well, the first thing to do anyway is to wind up the spring, because it needs some energy that was already wound. And I also usually put it on a slow speed, like, say, 8 frames per second. That way, when you're loading it, things don't move so fast, and it's not quite as dramatic. All right, so the supply film goes on the top, and the take-up goes there. So in a minute, I'll put a second spool on the bottom here. But here's our supply film. I put it on the top spindle there. Sometimes it's hard to get the square hole to line up with the square pin. Right. Like all motion picture mechanisms, it has moving sprocket wheels that rotate at a continuous speed, and it has a gate area where where the exposures are actually going to be made, and here the film has to move at an intermittent rate. So there needs to be a space in between the sprocket wheel and the gate where the film can bounce up and down a little bit like this. And at the bottom it's the same, it can bounce up and down a little bit. These areas are called the loops. So you'll see me make the loops for this camera when I thread it. I'll start by putting the film around. You have to make sure that the teeth on the sprocket wheel have met the perforations on the film, and they have. Then I fold around here, and here's this little room where the film will be able to jerk up and down like this when you're filming, so that it can move continuously in, but only in steps on the other side. Then the film goes through the gate. I'll close that, and then I'll make sure that the perforation has once again met the sprocket, the holes, the perforations on the film. And it has. So then I bend around again for the bottom sprocket wheel and push it in there, and then once again I just make sure that the film has met those teeth on the sprocket wheel, and it has. So now it's ready to run. I need a little bit more film so I can thread up this. I'm just running very slowly. Okay, and there's a slot in here where I'm going to poke the end of this film into that slot. These are called daylight loading spools. Some people load cameras in the dark. I prefer to load cameras in the light because I prefer to be able to see that it's been done entirely correctly and that there's no problem. If you load in the dark, you save a little bit of film because all of this film is now exposed to light, so it's ruined. And the first, say, 3 feet here are also exposed to light. But I think it's better to waste that little bit of film and be safe in the knowledge that everything's working. So I do a little test, and I can see that everything's working. So now put the cover on. And now that's ready to film. Well, it's not quite ready to film. I'll put the speed back up to 24 frames per second. And now I'm going to run the motor for 5 seconds to transport the film past that film that was exposed to light during loading. That's enough.